Greetings, YouTube. I recently read a game called Mithras, Mythras, and it was kind of an interesting fish. It was a system that uses the classic D&D 3 to 18 stat range, though it goes up and has no upper limit, like classic D&D or Pathfinder First Edition. Um, but it's a percentile-driven skill and combat system, which works just fine. It always seems more science fiction than fantasy to me, but there's nothing wrong with it. I mean, let's face it, a D20 system is just a percentile system in 5% chunks. Um, and it has five different traditions of magic, and they're all drastically different, which I thought was quite refreshing. It's kind of got a uh, low fantasy feel, not really Conan stuff, maybe just one step above that, but it definitely not high fantasy. And it's a nice change of pace, and I thought that was kind of cool. Um, but one of the things in it I found to be strange and I have to say disturbing was their take on intelligence. Now again, it's the classic standard D&D humans have a range of 3 to 18. So the lowest score a human can have and still be human is a 3, and the highest a human is going to have is an 18. Now, that makes 10, or technically 10 and a half, the average. But, 10 is considered the average score for a human. Um, and I have always viewed a 10 intelligence as the equivalent of a 100 IQ. I don't know when I started thinking of it like that. I'm not sure if that was my idea or I picked it up from somebody else. I don't. But I have just, in my memory, have always thought of a 10 intelligence to be the equivalent of a 100 IQ, and 100 is considered the human average. Now, I realize that the IQ scale has problems with it, and it was, originally essentially designed as a negative thing. It's like as like this is the baseline, and these people are under it kind of thing, and then it was basically used over time for other people's agendas. But I think it's to get just a numerical scale, which is what we need in gaming stuff. We want to get behind the veil and see the rules behind the world. It's one of the reasons I like tabletop role-playing games, because unlike the real world, where being an autistic person, you can't figure out anything, in a tabletop role-playing game, I can actually open the book and look at something and say, yeah, it says right there. Um, so I've always viewed a 10 as a 100 IQ, which means that a person who has a 12 is 120 IQ, and a person that has a 14 has 140, and that's the low bar for a genius. A person who has 140 IQ or higher is a genius, and 180 is a very high-ranged genius. And of course, when you get above that, because you're higher level and you've sunk your points into your intelligence because you're playing, a wizard, you're in the stratosphere. You're up there with Hawkings and things like that, or the equivalent therein of your high fantasy world. But let's face it, if you're not in a high fantasy world, you're not going to have a 21 intelligence. Um, and for me, if it goes down the same way, so a person with an 8 intelligence has an 80 IQ, all the way down to 30. Now, let's be honest. Someone with a 30 IQ is not going to be able to handle the day-to-day task on their own. They're going to have some kind of support network. But that's not going to be difficult to find in either the real world, your family or friends, or some kind of a group home or something like that. Or in a high fantasy, it's your adventuring party, also your family and your friends and things like that, because they could be the same thing or they could be distinct groups. Um, but it's still, if you're 3 or up, you're sapient. Okay, you may not be arguing, the virtues of like Liechtenstein and the uh, 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 Hawking's work on physics, but you still have the capacity for thought. You can still tell the difference between right and wrong. You can still tell the difference between an enemy and a friend. You just don't have a lot of cognitive, you know, muscle there. And under 3 is when you start getting into the range of animals. So most animals would be a 2. Uh, like insects are considered a 1, and you get down to like oozes and things, and they're a 0. Uh, and if a person ends up having their IQ pushed below that range, say because they've taken stat damage, they get down to a 0. They aren't dead, but they're essentially catatonic. You can't you have no cognitive capacity other than your autonomic system. You just sit there. All right. And like the enfeeble spell means that you essentially have no ability to do any thinking. You have no language skills left. You have no spell casting, no skill systems left, essentially. But you can tell who your friends are, and you can defend yourself. And I think that would fall into that same category if a person was driven down to a zero in be due to stat damage. Um, no, but Mithras did something a little different. Again, same stat range, 3 to 18, but they stated that if you have an intelligence below an 8, you are no longer sapient. You are functioning on a purely instinctive level. Now, when it came to monsters and animals, they actually had two different ways of looking at intelligence. If it has a sapient mind, it had an intelligence stat. Okay, but if it was not a sapient mind, because it was a monster or an animal or something, it has an instinct stat, instinction. So this is your instincts that drive you to survive. And some animals are better than others, so they actually had a range of instincts. So you're you had a score just like intelligence, but now it's a score that is below the level of true sapience. You are sentient. You are self-aware. You are aware of the universe, but you are not self-aware. So in the sense that I can react to the world, but I cannot be introspective. I do not know I'm a thinking being. I am just reacting to the world around me, even if I'm doing it in a clever way. Even if I've learned that, if I put this thing here, it gets me a benefit. I don't necessarily understand the reasoning behind it, but I know that if I put this thing here, I get a benefit. And I find the idea that you're thinking of a human being or other, player character species or things like that, um, as having an intelligence of 7 or less as not being sapient, highly problematic. Because for me, that's no different than saying if you have a 70 intelligence, you're not a person, except you are a person. Again, not as smart as somebody who's got 140 IQ, but you're still capable of speech. You're still capable of reason. You're still capable of moral judgment. All right? Just because you aren't arguing philosophy doesn't mean that you are not a human. So I found that stance to be really disturbing. It got under my skin in a way that I cannot shake. Now, I will freely admit that some of my concern about this is how I have seen the neurodivergent and those who have mental disabilities treated in the real world. And I will freely admit that I have a dog in that fight as I suffer from mental illness and I am neurodivergent. I suffer from executive dysfunction and I'm autistic. I may not have found out until I was 58, but it doesn't mean that I haven't always been disabled, and it doesn't mean that the world hasn't treated me like crap because of that disability, because it has. I have had to shoulder a lot of burden in trying to be human all the time when it was a difficult thing to do because I did not understand what was going on around me, and I had to do a lot of things through pure inference. I mimicked people. The speech cadence you're hearing right now is something I learned from another person. Literally, I can tell you that person's name. My brain latched on to that person's cadence, and it liked it, and it took it away. I didn't realize this for a long time, mind you. And it's particularly disturbing because I discovered at the later date that this person's a real asshat. But that doesn't change the fact that I still speak and think in this cadence. But I learned it from somebody else because I didn't have one. And I didn't know how to relate to people. And I saw how this person used his speech and his mannerisms to get what he wanted in life. I'm not saying I'm proud of that fact, but it was a step in controlling my environment because frankly, I was absolutely confused about how the environment worked. So if I could get good at manipulating people, to me it seemed like turnaround is fair play. The world had been manipulating me for decades. Maybe I can get something in my favor. I've since come to realize that there is times when gaming the system makes sense, but it's never going to be good if you're manipulating someone for a malicious intent. If you can manipulate someone and it's a neutral or a positive thing, I have no problem with that. I socially engineered a coworker so she stopped getting cream colored fuzz on my pea coat once by buying her a new sweater that was black. She loved it. She wore it all the time, and I never had to worry about cream colored fuzz on my pea coat ever again. And she never knew why I gave her a brand new sweater, but it worked. So I have a dog in this fight, and the idea that someone with an IQ of 7 or less, an intelligence 7 or less, is not sapient bothers me. So I need to know from my fellow gamers who are familiar with gaming systems that use the 3 to 18 range. Have you ever seen the intelligence score as the equivalent of an IQ? Because again, I've always done that. And I don't ever know when I haven't. It just seems to be something that was in the zeitgeist that just kind of bubbled up from the inside of my brain. But am I alone? Am I the only person that views a 10 intelligence as being the equivalent of 100 IQ? And you find it strange that someone would bake into their gaming system the idea that if you have less than an 8 intelligence, you aren't sapient. That bothers me. That to me that sounds a lot like eugenics. All right? And that's not a good thing. Okay? And I don't think it should be in our I don't think it should be baked into a rule system. So let's talk about intelligence, IQs, and whether we should be baking this kind of thing into a gaming system.